Today on Ancient DOS Games, we're taking a look at Theme Hospital, one of the very few games developed by Bullfrog Productions, which I'd never actually played up until now. I say the majority of stuff they made is stuff that I was keenly into and could wrap my head around, including their strategy games, like Populous and Dungeon Keeper, which is kind of surprising given how bad I am at strategy games in general. So why did I miss out on this one? Well, to be perfectly frank, the whole theme of healthcare. Doctors, hospitals, medicine, these are all things I don't like to think about, owing mostly to bad or indifferent memories. Now don't get me wrong, we need doctors and nurses and every medical specialist there is to ensure the health of our society. But just like my time in grade school, I don't like thinking about medical things when I don't have to. But still, even though thematically I don't enjoy this game at all, the ultimate question is, how does it play as a game? And the answer is, not bad. It has that trademark Bullfrog feel to it, where the difficulty very gradually ramps up as you get further and further in. And even if you're doing poorly, you probably still have a shot at recovering if you can figure out what it is that you're doing wrong. I will say though that this game is very overwhelming to get started with. I always play games a bit on my own accord first before I capture any footage so that as little time is spent learning the game on video as possible. And there's a night and day difference between how well I was playing when I first started compared to when I first started recording. That said, the game does have a few quirks which we'll get into, but it's nothing egregious. And this thing reminds me a lot of Roller Coaster Tycoon, which I played a bunch of when it was still relatively new. So if you don't mind the medical theme and those kinds of tycoon games are your jam, you'll probably get a kick out of this one. Though all things considered, Theme Hospital is way less complicated than even the first Roller Coaster Tycoon game. Theme Hospital was the last game Bullfrog Productions made for DOS before shifting focus to Windows gaming, with Electronic Arts publishing it as late as 1997. And much to my surprise, it's actually a 1 to 4 player simulation game. There's both networked and modem-based multiplayer in here, though because of how little impact opponent hospitals have on each other in this game, it's mostly just a race to see who can reach all the win conditions first. For performance reasons on low-end systems, and for playing back FMVs, the game does support VGA 320x200 256 color graphics, but for most people by this point in time, they'd most likely be running it in its 640x480 256 color SVGA graphics mode, which is actually required for certain menus. Now in terms of audio, curiously, this is one of the few late DOS games to only support Sound Blaster cards. Now, supposedly it also has support for the Ensoniq soundscape, but the files to support that card directly aren't included in the GOG version, at least as far as I can tell. As for its current release date, it's still commercial, but yes, readily available from the Good Old Games website at GOG.com for $6. Now if you want a physical copy, this is actually one of the easier DOS games to find, as they put out a large number of copies. So coming across one brand new for around $20 isn't unheard of, and I even ran across a couple such listings myself. More likely, you'll run into loose copies, which tend to go for between $8 and $10. The one thing to keep in mind is that the game also has a PlayStation and Macintosh ports. And it's supposedly a Windows release, but everything I've found online suggests there wasn't actually a Windows version, just that the DOS version was advertised to also work on Windows. Now, the PlayStation version shows up pretty frequently and looks very similar to the DOS version at first glance, so try not to confuse the two. Also, the Mac release is pretty rare from what I can tell, so if that's the port you specifically want a physical copy of, you might have a bit of a search on your hands. When starting a new game, you get a choice of 3 difficulty selections. However, like SimCity and other simulation-based games, all this affects is how much money you start with in every level. And since you can take out loans, this doesn't really end up affecting the overall gameplay to any major extent. Now that said, you also have 2 other options to choose, whether it's your first time playing and whether you want low-res gameplay instead of the default high-res gameplay. Now saying it's your first time playing will enable some additional tutorial messages and overlays to help guide your initial decisions. However, you're going to learn pretty quickly that the way you should be playing this game doesn't quite match the way the game thinks you want to play it. The game has a total of 10 hospitals, or rather 10 levels, for you to complete, with the win conditions being different on every level. Now each new level introduces new ailments you have to cure, though you always start each level with 0 research, meaning to get access to the equipment you need to cure certain ailments, you'll need to get research going, though the very first level has no research aspects in play. The basics of running a hospital in this game come down to following through with a series of steps for dealing with each patient who walks in. Now first, the patient will check in with the receptionist to enter queue to see a doctor in a GP office. Once a doctor is ready to see the patient, they'll talk to them and make an initial diagnosis, which will determine what the ailment is within a particular degree of certainty. At this point, lots of different things might happen, though if the diagnosis is not 100% certain, more tests will be performed in a general diagnosis room, or observations might be done by nurses in a ward. But regardless, sooner or later, a point will be reached where either the doctors are 100% certain what the specific ailment is, or all possible examinations have been exhausted with the facilities on hand. Now, if you don't have the necessary facilities to deal with a specific ailment, you can either send a patient home or have them wait around while you attempt to build those facilities so that the proper cure can be administered. However, even though the ailments are obvious, the cures are not, as doctors need to precisely determine the specific strand of an ailment or such, meaning if after all the tests are done, the diagnosis still isn't 100%, you can either take the chance at a cure, which might kill the patient if the odds fail, or you can send them away to let a different hospital deal with them. Regardless, if you cure a patient of an ailment, you get paid and they leave the hospital. As basically what this game comes down to is having the proper facilities, equipment, and manpower to deal with that sequence over and over again, while at the same time making sure the hospital itself is properly equipped to deal with basic human needs. Now, the simplest hospital to run that will have any ability to function at all will simply have a GP office and a pharmacy, as most early ailments in a level only require drugs to cure. But you're also going to need to have specialized rooms to deal with specific ailments, like an inflator room to deal with popping swollen heads and re-inflating them to the correct size, or a slack tongue room to chop off excess tongue, or even just the bathroom, because people do need to go to the bathroom every now and then, especially if they've been keeping hydrated through the vending machines you place around. However, you're only making the high-level decisions. If you're doing your job right, the hospital should be running mostly on its own accord without you having to micromanage every little thing. Now, this means having a capable and competent staff. And there are 4 kinds of staff members you can hire: doctors, nurses, handymen, and receptionists. Now, each person you hire has a little write-up about their habits and everything, but the most important thing to look at is the level of competency, represented with a bar showing an abacus on the low end and a computer on the high end. Now, staff who are more competent either do their job better, get better results, or can even move or do their job faster, though they also have a higher salary. Each staff member also has a tiredness rating and morale. Now, tiredness determines how likely a staff member will make a mistake or start refusing to do their job, and by default, they'll be ordered to rest and recuperate at 60% tiredness automatically. Now, resting is done by using one of the luxuries placed within a staff room, meaning the more distractions you put in such a room, the more staff members can use it at a time. However, staff members also have a morale level. I wasn't quite able to figure out how morale fluctuated, but if you have a staff member's morale get too low, they'll demand a pay raise or threaten to leave. Now, if you spot low morale before getting the demand for a pay raise, you can throw a one-time 10% salary bonus at such a staff member to bump their morale back up, which is usually the better thing to do. Keeping the hospital running well also requires that people be comfortable inside it, both patients and staff members. Now, this is accomplished by keeping the place heated and with potted plants. The radiators can't just be placed at random, as they have a radius of effect, so you want to try to position them apart from each other to some extent. You can also raise the power of the radiators at the cost of paying more for heat, though this does mean having to place down less of them. Potted plants help to keep morale up, but only if they're kept watered, which is one of the many tasks for your handymen, who also sweep up trash and maintain specialized machines. Actually, the way machines work is kind of interesting. Each specialized machine has a strength rating. This is the number of times the machine can safely be used without maintenance. Normally, your handyman will try to get around to maintaining the machine if its use count is near its strength count, but if the use count exceeds the strength count, there's a chance the machine might explode the next time it's used, destroying the room it's in and preventing said room from ever being utilized again, or even removed. The trick here, however, is that each time a machine is maintained, there's a chance its strength rating will drop, which is much more likely the higher the use count presently is. Now, eventually, it'll be a good idea to just replace the machine entirely to reset its strength count back to maximum, which typically costs almost as much as building the room that was designed to house the machine in the first place. Eventually, as you run your hospital, various events are going to happen, which you're going to need to respond to. Now, one of the most common events is dealing with VIPs. When a VIP comes to tour your hospital, their opinion of the place will be determined by what happens inside the hospital during their stay. Not to mention, if you have too few fire extinguishers or nowhere for your patients to sit, they're going to notice stuff like that too. ultimately, when they leave, you'll either get a reputation bonus and some extra cash, or if they were very much dismayed by what they saw, you'll take a reputation hit. Now, you can turn away VIPs, but unless you're in a really bad state, you probably should just invite them in anyways, because even an average showing will net you a little extra cash. And that's something that's easy to forget while you're playing, is that you're technically competing against other hospitals. When you pull up your stats screen, you can see how well you're doing compared to your competition, and can also see how close you are to hitting all of the win states. Now, once you hit every win state and maintain those numbers for a period of time, the offer to move on to the next level will be shown. Now, if you decline this offer, you won't move on to the next level and will just keep playing the current one. However, so long as you maintain a winning state, you'll get new offers to move on every once in a while, possibly with better salary values, which do come into play, as your salary is added to your finances every time one in-game year passes. Though speaking of the passage of time, that's one thing that's a little weird at first. The in-game time is measured in days and passes very quickly, far faster than seems normal, and yet this is the normal game speed. And I think it was done this way in order to perpetuate staff wages to a more notable degree, but it's definitely odd given that you can technically end up with a VIP visiting for an entire month or such. And that said, you can adjust how fast time passes to an extreme degree. The normal setting runs at 18.2 frames per second, same as the default DOS interrupt timer rate. However, when you set the game to its slowest setting, it takes a full second for a single frame of gameplay to pass, thus time is moving 18.2 times slower than at the normal speed. Now, turning the game speed down can be important, especially when you first start a new level, as time is always passing. Even when you have stat screens or other screens up, time does not stop. This means if you want to fuss around with building a new room or just getting your hospital into a viable state to begin with, it's going to take some time and some planning, in which case having the game speed turned all the way down is essential for getting those things done before too long, especially given that patients might be slowly dying while waiting for you to build the rooms needed for their treatment, and rival hospitals will be getting their act together and opening up pretty quickly too. I should probably mention a couple other features in the game too, which don't come into play too often, but are things you can tinker with to see how it affects everything. Now, one of the things you can set is when to end a diagnosis. Now, normally, a diagnosis ends when it reaches 100%, or the limit of what your doctors and equipment can determine is reached. However, you can over-diagnose. There's pros and cons to doing this. The pro is that you get more money out of every individual patient who walks through your doors. But the con is that they spend longer being diagnosed. Now, diagnosing more than you need to can earn you extra cash, but only if you haven't backlogged your patients. In fact, not having enough GP offices or general diagnosis rooms, not to mention doctors to run them, is one of the biggest bottlenecks you're going to hit, even without overdiagnosing. You can also fiddle with treatment costs, as for each ailment you discover, you can assign how much to charge a patient when you cure them. Now, this is pretty much analogous to the player's ability to adjust individual tax ratios for different industries in SimCity, as charging more for a treatment will result in less people with that ailment visiting the hospital and instead visiting a rival, while charging less will increase the number of people coming in to be treated, but you earn less from each treatment administered. Well, that said, once you have research going, you can use the treatment cost screen to focus research on specific ailments, in case you want to improve how well you can handle them sooner rather than later. One last thing to mention too, which isn't explained very well in the manual, is that if you pick up and drop a staff member in a particular room, they'll become assigned to that room, meaning they will not leave it on their own accord, save for basic necessities, like taking breaks, and they'll then go right back to that same room again. To unassign someone from a room, you simply drop them into any other part of the hospital which isn't a specific room. Now, you can also disable the ability to leave rooms in general, meaning each person you hire will only ever work in the specific room you assign them to. Now, this isn't something you have to worry about in the early game, but much later in when you have to run very large hospitals, it might be a good idea to dedicate every single staff member to a specific room to keep things running smoothly. Overall, Theme Hospital is a decent game. While the initial learning curve is very steep, it's also brief, and then from that point forward, the game simply gradually increases in difficulty and is otherwise extremely playable, with only minor quirks to get used to. I still don't like it though. Playing this game just makes me think about healthcare in general, and the times I've had to be in doctor's offices or hospitals, trying to figure out why I'm in pain, or trying to sleep in weird places with electrodes attached to my head, because yeah, I had to go through that when I was originally getting diagnosed with my circadian rhythm disorder. Twice. Granted, I've never broken a bone or dislodged anything, though a couple ligaments in my knees are completely torn apart, preventing me from doing certain kinds of rotational motions without my knees popping out. It makes some seemingly mundane activities like golfing or dancing actually surprisingly dangerous for me to attempt. Yeah, medicine and medical things are stuff I just don't want to think about, because just the act of thinking about it makes me uncomfortable and feels debilitating. Now, if that kind of stuff doesn't bother you and you enjoy simulation games or tycoon games, then this one's going to be right up your alley and absolutely worth a try, because again, this is a solid game. It's just not a game for me. And yep, no special settings needed for running this game in DOSBox. Just leave cycle set to auto and you're good to go. Anywho, that's all for episode 273 of Ancient DOS Games. Next week's a filler, and I've got a fairly neat topic lined up, which should leave all of you with tons of things to go check out when I'm done. So be sure to stay tuned for next Saturday to see what I've got in store. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small random selection of you all.